Professor Ashley Lucas, and we're here today with Aaron Kinzel, who teaches at the University of Michigan at Dearborn, and one of his students, Moe Rahman. And we're delighted to have you all here with us today. We talked to Aaron in an earlier session about the life that led you to become a professor and your graduate studies, and now today we're going to be focusing on your teaching, which is why you brought one of your very best students to join us. So could you tell us a little bit about what it is you teach and what you're hoping your students will get out of your classes?
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Glad to be here with Moe.
Yep, thank you.
We are a part of the Criminology and Criminal Justice Studies program. Moe is one of the students in that program. It's a major for bachelor studies. I've been teaching there for roughly a year now. I've taught several classes over the last year: race, crime, and justice, criminal justice systems and policy, criminology, and this semester I'm teaching a new course in corrections. Basically, the idea is to get students ready for different fields in the criminal justice areas and also a background in criminology. So criminal justice encompasses three major areas: law enforcement, the judiciary, and corrections. And criminology is basically the study of crime or why people commit crime. So we want our students to be really versed in both those aspects as they go forward in their careers.
And what do most of your students end up doing in their careers?
We actually have, on the Dearborn campus, a lot of our students are currently in law enforcement or would like to go into that trajectory as well. But we also have students who are interested in paralegal studies or go off to law school to become attorneys, depending on the area, which might be civil or criminal lawyers, depending on what their calling is. We have a lot of students who are interested in the corrections field as well. So that would be, if they're local, the Michigan Department of Corrections, where they could possibly start out as a frontline correctional officer or work up in the system to be an administrator, depending on, counselor, education staff, whatever it may be. And those are the three major ones that I can think of off the top of my head. Moe, what is the area that you'd be interested in going into?
Me, law enforcement wise, I'll
Okay.
start off with state police and hopefully I'll end up in DEA or Homeland Security.
And what drew you to that career?
Me, as a young person, as a young man, I got myself into a lot of trouble, and getting into trouble, I always thought I'd get away with it. And I met one officer that had some compassion towards me, and basically, he taught me a few lessons. And he sat down with me and just told me, he goes, you have a choice. You can be on this side, or you can be on that side. And that kind of drew me towards, because my outlook on law enforcement was always negative growing up, and that actually showed me, not everyone's the same. There are people in the field that are actually trying to make a difference. And seeing what kind of things were happening to people around me, so I said to myself, I have two choices: go to school and get an education, get into law enforcement, or end up behind bars.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see law enforcement helping people in the community?
Well, a lot of things, despite what you see in social media or mainstream media, law enforcement is very active within the community. There are lots of people, there are lots of officers that are trying to bring back a lot of these communities, that are patrolling all the time, that are actually helping people out, letting people slide once or twice for things that they people make mistakes on. I see law enforcement not always being punitive. They do, they do try to help.
I think it's really important for us to have a conversation about how law enforcement can help right now, because we've had such extraordinary tension between the very worst side of law enforcement showing up so strongly in the media because of the shooting deaths that we've encountered in our communities across the country. And it's hard for people to trust law enforcement these days. But the vast majority of people working in law enforcement are not the ones who are necessarily shooting people. So I think it's a tough conversation to have right now, but one that we really need.
It is.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that we need to look at as a society is that, like you mentioned, a vast majority of law enforcement out there are doing like Moe says. They're trying to be a part of the community. They're trying to integrate and create bonds and cohesion between law enforcement and the community. But the problem is when we have these bad apples in law enforcement, and I believe a bigger problem that we get from this is that currently the criminal justice system is not really weeding out those bad apples. There's very few mechanisms to pull out the people who it's quite clear are going beyond not only just their duties, but also even crossing into criminality. And I feel as a society, and certainly the social media can sensationalize different things, but there are definitely certain instances where it's very clear that an officer has crossed the line and even crossed the line to criminality or murder, and yet they're not being punished for that. And I feel that there's a problem that we have inherently with the system, where like there's this relationship between the district attorney's office and law enforcement, and that I think that's creating a problem to where DA are not bringing charges against officers when there should be charges, even despite public outcry for justice. And I think that's causing problems in the community. And then we see all these bad apples as a blanket painting of the whole system where all cops are bad cops, and that's not the case. So I think we got to look at ways of punishing the cops who are doing criminal acts or going outside the scope of their duties from a policy perspective, and punishing them maybe administratively or from a policy perspective internally. And we're not doing that. So I think until we do that as a society, it's going to be harder for people in the community to really be able to rebuild those social bonds and that structure and have that feeling of safety being around law enforcement.
Well, as a professor, as somebody who is on the front lines of training folks who are going to go into these careers, how do you prepare your students to enter what is often a hostile environment, even under the best of circumstances, to be in law enforcement, the judiciary, or in corrections, is to deal with a lot of people who are in a great deal of pain, and many of them who feel that all of those potential agencies they're encountering, the police, the courts, the prisons, are oppositional.
Yeah, there's an adversarial relation, or at least a perceived one.
Right.
Absolutely.
So what do you do to get your students ready to enter that environment?
The biggest thing that I try to do is create experiential learning experiences for my students, and where they're interacting with a lot of the people who may have committed crimes previously. The biggest thing I think is important is to humanize individuals, all people, whether they have been justice involved, whether they're law enforcement, a judge, a DA, corrections officer, whoever it may be. We all have humanity, and I think that that is our strongest connection bond, beyond race, beyond ethnicity, religious affiliation. We all share humanity, and I think that I try to humanize people, and I think it's important for students to understand that we have many more similarities than we have differences. So my pedagogical technique, per se, would be to get them exposed to different actors throughout, not just the criminal justice system, from a professional standpoint, whether they're hanging out with cops, lawyers, judges, DAs, corrections officers or administrators, or visiting prisons and seeing that environment, but like people that have been cycled through the system like myself, someone who's been justice involved as a youth and as an adult, to humanize that population. Because a lot of times people that become justice involved, there's a stigma, particularly people who are convicted of felonies, that follows them throughout their entire lives, as if they're disregarded and they are not, and from a policy standpoint, they technically cannot be full citizens under some circumstances, but to humanize them and accept them back in the community, because I think it's important to understand that 95% of the people that do become incarcerated at one point are coming home. So the question then becomes, do we want people who are just pissed off at the world and have no opportunities for upwards mobility, or do we want to embrace people and not necessarily give them handouts, but a hand up, in order to reacclimate to society and create safer neighborhoods for everybody? So that's what I try to focus on doing. Moe has been on several of my different trips. I think the most recent, we were at the Ohio State Reformatory, which is an empty shell of a prison. We went down there for a trip. Before that, we did a trip to the Monroe County Jail and actually toured that facility. And it was a real eye-opener, I think, for some of our students to kind of like physically feel what it's like to be that environment. And I think Moe can probably elaborate that a little bit more, kind of what he got from that experience and how that kind of like perhaps gave him a better impression about the realm and his career trajectory.
A lot of times, I spoke to a lot of students as well. The consensus is, you do a crime, you do the time. A lot of people don't understand how some of these people come out and they go right back to recidivism. They go right back to criminality. A lot of things people don't understand is the kinds of things that these people go through. Once, fair play, you do the crime, you do the time, but once you're inside, what are you going through? Emotional, physical, mental. I mean, a lot of times you're getting in trouble. You might go into solitary confinement. The kind of mental problems that this creates for an individual, as well as getting out. And since 1994, with all the grants being taken away, with all these people, mass incarceration going on, a lot of times they're in prison, they're not getting any kind of education, they're not learning any kind of trade skills. So once they come out, they cannot be a returning citizen, how they say it, because they come out and they can't get a job. As soon as you apply for a job, you have to go ahead and tick that box. Doesn't matter how much how much skill trade you have or education. At that point, you are a convicted felon. So a lot of the times, I know a lot of people watching today might not understand this, but you're forced to return to criminality, because just like us, they have bills to pay. They have kids that they have to clothe, they have to feed. They have bills, they have car insurance, this and that, and you have to do whatever you have to do for your family in order to support them. I'm not saying it's right what they do if you're returning back to criminality, but you have to do something to survive. And I think a lot of times in Professor's class, we've learned about having compassion toward these people. That just because someone did something wrong, it doesn't define them for the rest of their lives. They have the ability to change, but we must help them. Again, you have to give them a hand and help them out.
So what did actually going into some of these facilities do for your understanding of what people in prison go through?
Seeing the confinement that they're in. I mean, especially with the Ohio Reformatory, they were very small. And
The cells were small.
Cells were very small. And, you have, your bathroom in there, no privacy. You're stripped of all your rights. And seeing that, you have a better understanding of why people come out the way they do.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say to those people who say you do the crime, you do the time, this is what's good enough for those people?
I say put yourself in their shoes. I say think about it being your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, being stuck in that kind of place. Put yourself in that shoes. Think about if you were stuck in a cell for however many hours. If you were stripped of all your rights. If you came out of prison, you did your time that society says you gotta have to do, and yet you're still stigmatized with all this. Think about how you would feel. Think about if you were highly qualified for a job, but because you had a record, you could not get the job. Put yourself in those shoes and see how would it make you feel.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are a lot of people who have more access to that life than we tend to admit. A lot of people that I talk to about prisons say, well, most people don't know X, Y, and Z, or most people never know somebody who've been to a prison. But you talk to people long enough, and it turns out that a whole lot of us actually do know somebody who's had to do some time, and we're just not having that conversation in an honest way.
I mean, I've seen different statistics that say anywhere between 70 to 100 million have had some type of justice involvement throughout the duration of their lives. And that's a substantial, portion of our population here in the United States. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean someone did time in prison, but they've either been on probation, arrested, whatever, county jail time, some type of contact with the justice system. So they have some record somewhere in a paper trail through a law enforcement check that they have been justice involved. And that's just like Moe mentioned, that's a stigma. I've personally gone through that throughout, a big part of my life post-incarceration. It took me 6 years post-release to find a job. And it wasn't a lack of me trying. I had an associate's, a bachelor's, and a master's degree here from the University of Michigan, and yet I could not find employment. Nobody would give me an opportunity, and I certainly understand because I had a violent crime involving law enforcement, and yet I've done a lot of things to kind of better myself and improve myself in the community academically and just my personality and my work, but yet it took me 6 years post-release to get a job. My first job was a professor at Western Michigan University. So I want to throw my props out to them right now for hiring me on, and then working for them for 3 years, creating a good work ethic, great teaching evaluations, and stuff like this that I'm doing with Moe and other students now at U of M, where we're doing these experiential prison tours and stuff where students are feeling carceral spaces. They're really, I'm creating an academic environment in which they really experience it. I don't want my kids to get locked up and have to go through the trauma that I went through and others went through. But it's the best, the secondary thing to where they can actually feel it. And I usually bring other formerly incarcerated people in with us to describe that situation in graphic detail as much that they're willing to be vulnerable and describe. Like when I go back in, even as an empty shell, and Moe could probably even say, I get kind of weird. I probably shut down a little bit. I'm not as talkative. I can go off on tangents sometimes. But when I go back into these spaces, it's reliving a trauma. And I think that's one big thing that we don't talk about in American society is how people who are justice involved have a lot of trauma to deal with. Even if they don't have moderate or severe mental health issues, trauma is a mental health thing. It needs to be looked at from a public health lens. And how are ways that we can alleviate that to help people acclimate back into society?
And we so seldom do. I mean,
Absolutely.
those services are very seldom provided to folks as a part of reentry, and they're seen even as a luxury. When you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight or how you're going to get your paycheck, the idea of mental health services seems pretty distant. So, why is it worth it to you to go through that trauma again? And how do you respond to the people who would say, oh, taking your class into a prison is like taking the students to see the animals in the zoo? It's this exploitative, let's look at all the people who are currently locked up. How do you respond to that critique? And why are you so willing to engage in your own trauma again?
I think the biggest reason I'm willing to go into that environment again is, first and foremost, I think it's me conquering a fear. And I think I'm building myself stronger mentally and physically to relive that and conquer it, and to where I think the more and more I go into facilities, the less and less it affects me, particularly from like anxiety or just it's the overwhelming stress of the experience. So I think like I'm like conquering it in a sense. And the other part would be that I think it's important for students to be in this space. Well, honestly, most of the time when we go to these facilities, they're empty. So these are prisons that are no longer inhabited. So it's not really a zoo where everybody's just looking at the convicts running around. So they're experiencing the carceral state, and they go into like the cell where, like Mo said, like some of these rooms that we went into, like both him and I are both big men. Like we put our hands out like this. That's your room. You reach up and you're touching the ceiling. I mean, that's just incredibly tiny, and some people live their lives there. So for them to physically see, smell, hear, and touch all that, I think is profound. It takes them there to that moment in time. Even though it's just a short period of like an hour, I think that's a way to kind of develop a respect for that space and vicariously live through that trauma in a sense. Particularly when people like myself or other people who've been justice involved speak to students like Mo or other students and describe that. How did it make them feel when they lived in a space like this? But also, like, I've done work with the Prison Creative Arts Project going inside where I don't feel it's a zoo. I feel when I bring students in and I've done workshops, I think it's an incredibly interactive exchange. And I feel the students who've never experienced that, they connect with people who are in the prison. I think some things kind of change their perspective, that experience. And maybe they had a negative experience or perspective going in, but when they meet these people, and not everybody's snapshot of the crime that they did defines them throughout their entire life or who they are as a person. I think I'm a perfect example of that. I did some crazy stuff as a kid, and yet here I am today, totally flipping the script to where, I'm a professional. I will soon have a doctorate degree, which is the highest academic credential you can get. I'm serving my community. I'm not destroying it any longer. And I'm engaging students and other members of the community because I want peace, cohesion. I want law enforcement to be able to make me think that I feel safe in my community. I want the judges, the DA to do the right thing, and I want to create order in our society. And then corrections, I want to see punishment, but I also want to see rehabilitation in tandem with that. Because if we're too punitive on people like we've been over the last 4 decades, this is the response, mass incarceration. We have over 2 million people incarcerated. And I think a large part of that is because of the punitiveness and the lack of rehabilitative programming and the stigma that we place upon convicted felons. So there's no out of that cycle. When you've got statistically 3 out of 4 people that return back to the system within 5 years, something's wrong. We're not doing anything right. And this has just been increasing over the years. So we need to rethink and be smart on crime as opposed to tough on crime, and just lock people away.
Mo, what does it mean to you to have a formerly incarcerated professor?
This ought to be good.
Gotta rethink this.
Your grade's not out yet, so.
I know. It gives me a different perspective. I've been there, done that. Obviously, Not to that extent, but throughout my degree, I've heard a lot from professors that have gone to school that have read about this, that are professionals that teaching this. However, I've yet to get, until I took Professor Kinzel, that experience from the inside. We always learn about what the person did, how much time they did, mass incarceration, this and that, but you don't ever get a first-hand experience of someone who's lived that life, because you always get told about something and they sensationalize it. They make it sound one way, but when you actually hear it from someone that's experienced it, you learn about the real truths that media won't show, truths that books don't tell, and it's nice to get that perspective from someone that's actually experienced it.
And what kind of truth does he tell you? What that the media didn't? What did you learn?
About what goes on inside prison, the ease of the availability of drugs, the availability of phones, contraband, a lot of times we do see in media here this and that, but a lot of times I wonder how are all these drugs getting in there? And he's taught us from personal experience, you have guards, you have corrupt guards, you have corrupt officials in the prison system themselves supplying a lot of the convicts with these tools, and it's nice to know where everything's coming from.
And when you are thinking about your own career in law enforcement, how will your relationship with this professor and this program influence your behavior?
I think I'm going to be more compassionate and more understanding. I do look at myself and think I am pretty compassionate and understanding before, but even now, you look at different communities, different neighborhoods that have been targeted by police. You can talk about over-policing, you talk about just racism, stereotyping. I think it's helped me to understand, just because some person is dressed like some way, drives a certain car, does not make that person like that. One of the classes we learned about, in some societies, dressing up like that, having certain shoes and things like that, that's a good sign. And you just can't always judge someone on how they look. And that's about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both so much for coming here to join us today. It's been an honor to get to talk to you. And I hope that many students, both in your classroom and watching us online, will be able to benefit from all you have to teach us.
Well, thank you, Ashley.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.